Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I'm NJ, and I'm so glad you're here tonight. Whether you've been with this channel for years, drifting off to these documentaries so often that my voice has become part of your evenings, or whether tonight is the very first time you've found us, thank you, genuinely. This channel exists because of you, because of the comments, the suggestions, the quiet company of people all over the world who come here when everything else has gone still. Before we begin, a few small things. Sleep into Power is on Spotify now, so if you'd rather listen with your screen off and your phone face down in the dark, every documentary is waiting for you there. And if you'd like to keep these ideas closer to hand, the Sleep into Power book is available on Amazon, in paperback and on Kindle. Tonight's journey was requested more times than almost any other. So many of you asked for this one, in the comments, in messages, quietly and persistently over months. You know who you are, and this is for you. And wherever you are right now, whatever the hour is where you're listening, whether it's just gone midnight in Manchester, the small hours in Toronto, a late evening in Melbourne, or somewhere quiet in between, you're welcome here. Lower the lights. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. There is nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to follow, nothing you need to stay awake for. If you drift away in the first 10 minutes, that is exactly as it should be. Tonight we are going somewhere very old. We are going to walk slowly through a single night in ancient Greece. Not a lecture, not a list of dates, but one continuous journey, beginning at sunset on a harbor in the Aegean and ending as the first light comes up over the sea. Between those two moments we will move through temples and olive groves, through marketplaces after the crowds have gone, through the schools where human beings first learned to ask what the world is made of, and through the minds of a handful of people whose questions have never stopped echoing. So let the room soften around you. Let your breathing find its own pace. And let us begin where every Greek journey began, at the edge of the water. It is early evening, somewhere around 500 years before the Common Era, and you are standing on a stone quay in a small harbor town. The sun has just gone down behind the headland, and the sea, which was blinding all afternoon, has turned the color of dark wine. The Greeks noticed that color too. In their oldest poetry, the sea is described as wine dark, and nobody has ever entirely settled the question of what they meant by it. Only that anyone who has watched the Aegean at dusk understands the phrase without needing it explained. The heat is going out of the stones beneath your feet. You can feel it leaving degree by degree, the way warmth leaves a loaf of bread on a windowsill. The air smells of salt, of pine resin from the boats, of wood smoke beginning to rise from the houses on the hill, and underneath it all, faintly, of the wild thyme that grows on every slope in this country and gets crushed underfoot 100 times a day. This is the world we are entering, and the first thing worth saying about it is that it was small. We speak of ancient Greece as though it were a country, but there was no such country. There was no capital, no king of all the Greeks, no single flag. What existed instead were hundreds of separate communities, each one built around a town and the land it could see, each fiercely, sometimes absurdly, independent. They called such a community a polis, and it is from that word that we get politics, and police, and metropolis. Some were substantial. Athens, at its height, may have held a couple of 100,000 people across its whole territory. Many others were tiny, a few thousand souls in a valley with a temple and a spring and a stretch of coast. Look up now, at the hill above the harbor. Near the top, catching the last of the light, is a temple. You would know it anywhere. Columns, evenly spaced, holding up a triangle of stone. But here is the thing almost nobody expects, and the first of the small surprises I want to leave with you tonight. That temple is not white. The columns are painted. The carvings along the top are painted in strong reds and blues and gold, and the eyes of the statues are painted too, so that in daylight the whole building blazes with color like a fairground. Our idea of ancient Greece as a world of pure white marble is an accident of time, the color weathered away over 2,000 years, and then a misunderstanding hardened into taste when Renaissance and later European artists, finding the marble bare, assumed it had always been so. The Greeks would have found our white ruins rather sad. They liked their gods bright. The temple is not a church either. Nobody gathers inside it to worship. The building is a house, quite literally, a house for the god, containing the statue, and the rituals happen outside at the altar, in the open air, under the sky, which means that on a night like this, the temple is simply standing there in the dusk, doing what it has always done, holding the last light a little longer than the ground below. Now turn away from the sea and walk inland with me, up through the town, into the streets. Lamps are being lit now, one at a time, little clay vessels of olive oil with a wick at the spout, giving off a light that is warmer and dimmer than anything electric, a light that does not so much illuminate a room as gather people into a circle inside it. That is worth pausing on for a moment as you lie there in the dark. For almost all of human history, night meant the shrinking of the visible world to the size of a single flame, and everything anyone did after sunset happened within that small gold circle. Conversation, storytelling, philosophy, love, fear. The Greeks did their deepest thinking by exactly this kind of light. Ahead, the lane opens out into a square. This is the agora, the marketplace, and by day, it is the loudest place in any Greek town. But the day is over now. The stalls are being packed away, awnings rolled, baskets stacked. A woman is sweeping crushed leaves and fish scales into the gutter. Two men stand talking beside a stone bench, in no hurry to finish. Further off, someone is playing a stringed instrument badly and cheerfully, and a child is being called in from somewhere higher up the hill. We are going to come back to this square, not tonight exactly, but soon, because in a city not far from here, an old man with a snub nose and bare feet will spend his entire life standing in a square very much like this one, asking people questions they cannot answer. But before we meet him, we need to travel across the water, eastwards, to a wealthy port city on the coast of what is now Turkey, because roughly a century before Socrates was born, in that city, something happened that had never quite happened before. A man looked at the world and asked a question about it, without once mentioning the gods. Let your eyes close now. The lamps are lit, the sea is dark, and we are going to Miletus. Miletus, on a warm night in the 6th century before our era. It is a richer place than the little harbor we have just left. 4 natural harbors, ships from Egypt and Phoenicia and the Black Sea, warehouses stacked with wool and grain and dye. Milesian merchants had founded colonies all around the northern seas, dozens of them, small Greek towns scattered along foreign coastlines like seeds thrown from a passing hand. Money was arriving here from everywhere, and so, more importantly, were ideas. Somewhere in this city, an elderly man is standing in a courtyard looking up at the stars. His name is Thales, and almost everything we know about him arrives through a fog of stories told long after his death. He was an engineer of some kind, and a merchant, and he traveled to Egypt, where the priests had been keeping astronomical records for centuries, and to Babylon, or at least he had access to what the Babylonians knew. He was practical. One story has him cornering the market in olive presses after predicting a good harvest, purely to prove that a philosopher could make money if he considered it worth his time. Another story, the most famous, says he predicted an eclipse of the sun. The historian Herodotus, writing some 150 years afterwards, tells us that a battle between the Lydians and the Medes was halted when day suddenly turned into night, and that Thales had foretold that this would happen within that year. Modern astronomy confirms there was indeed a total eclipse over Asia Minor on the 28th of May, 585 before the Common Era. What modern historians doubt, and doubt strongly, is whether Thales could really have predicted it, because the mathematics needed to forecast a solar eclipse for a particular place simply did not exist in his lifetime. So the story sits in that interesting middle ground where much of early Greek history lives. A real event, a real man, and a claim about the two that we can neither prove nor quite let go of. But there is one thing about Thales that does not depend on legend, and it is the reason we are standing in his courtyard tonight. He asked what the world was made of. That question sounds so ordinary now that it is hard to feel the shock in it. So let me put it another way. Before Thales, in Greece, and almost everywhere else, when someone asked why the sea storms, or why the earth shakes, or where the world came from, the answer was a story about a person. Poseidon is angry. The gods are quarreling. In the beginning there was chaos, and from chaos came earth, and earth bore sky, and from their union came the rest. These were not stupid answers. They were rich, beautiful, psychologically true answers, and we will spend a whole chapter with them later tonight. But they all shared a shape. They explained the world by telling you who did it. Thales proposed something different. He suggested that beneath all the changing appearances of the world, there is one underlying substance, and that everything, the sea, the stones, the goat, the star, is that one substance in different arrangements. He thought the substance was water. He was wrong. That hardly matters. What matters is the form of the answer. No personalities, no divine tempers, just a proposal about the nature of things, offered in a way that another human being could examine, test against experience, and disagree with. And someone did disagree, almost immediately, which is the second half of the miracle. His student was called Anaximander, and he did not simply repeat what his teacher had said. He argued that the underlying stuff could not be water, because water is one of the opposing forces in the world, and if any single one of the opposites were the source of everything, it would long ago have swallowed the others. So he proposed instead something he called the apeiron, the boundless, an indefinite substance without qualities of its own, from which all the definite things emerge and to which they return. It is an astonishing piece of reasoning to find at the very beginning of the tradition, and it commits Anaximander to a thought that later Greeks found deeply unsettling, that our world may be one among many, appearing and dissolving over vast stretches of time. After Anaximander came Anaximenes, who thought both of them had overcomplicated it, and proposed that the fundamental substance is air, thickening into water and stone as it condenses, thinning into fire as it spreads. Again, wrong. Again, it does not matter. Because look at what has quietly been created in a single city within a couple of generations. A conversation. Not a scripture, not a set of pronouncements to be memorized, but a chain of people taking one another's ideas seriously enough to improve on them, correct them, and pass them on. Thales' greatest achievement was not water, it was Anaximander. He created the first person in the Western tradition who was licensed to say to a teacher, with respect, "I think you have got that wrong, and here is why." That absence, more than any Greek genius, may be the deepest reason philosophy started here. Let the boldness of it settle for a moment. Somebody stood under a sky nobody understood, in a world where the causes of almost everything were unknown, and instead of reaching for a story about a god's temper, reached for a hypothesis. The night above him was full of lights whose nature was a total mystery. He had no telescope, no mathematics of gravitation, no notion of what a star was. And he began, anyway, with the simplest and most audacious sentence a human being can say about the universe. Perhaps it is all one thing. The lamp in the courtyard is burning low now. The old man is still looking up. Out in the harbor, the ships lie at their moorings with their masts making slow arcs against the constellations, and the tide is turning, and the whole coastline is settling into that deep part of the night where even the dogs have stopped. But other minds are awake elsewhere in this world, and they are asking questions stranger than his. One of them has a school where the members will not eat beans and are forbidden to speak of what they have learned. Another lives in a mountain town and writes in riddles that have been argued over for 2,500 years. And a third has arrived at a conclusion so extreme that he denies the evidence of his own eyes. Stay with me. We are only just beginning, and the night is long. Cross the sea westwards with me now, to the southern coast of Italy, where the Greeks had planted so many cities that the Romans later called the whole region Great Greece. In one of those cities, Croton, there is a house where a group of men and women live together under rules that would strike almost anyone as peculiar. They hold their property in common. They rise before dawn and walk alone to compose their thoughts before speaking to anyone. New members must remain silent for years, listening only, before they are permitted to ask a question. They will not eat meat, they will not wear wool, and they will not, under any circumstances, eat beans. When one of their number dies, they hold a funeral for him if he leaves the order alive, because to leave is to be dead to them. At the center of this household is Pythagoras. Almost nothing about him can be established with confidence. He wrote nothing that survives, and within a century of his death, he had already become a figure of legend, credited with a golden thigh, with being in 2 cities at once, with having remembered his previous lives. What can be said is that he came from the island of Samos, that he settled in Italy, that he founded a community of extraordinary intensity, and that the ideas associated with his name changed the shape of Western thought. The theorem that carries his name was known to Babylonian mathematicians 1,000 years before he was born, so we should be careful there. But the discovery that seems genuinely to belong to his circle is stranger and more beautiful, and you can test it yourself with a guitar string tonight. Take a stretched string and pluck it. Now stop it exactly halfway and pluck again. The note that sounds is the same note, an octave higher. Stop it at 2/3 of its length, and you get a perfect fifth, the interval that opens almost every hymn you have ever heard. At 3/4, a fourth. The intervals we find beautiful, that human beings across the world have independently found beautiful, correspond to simple whole number ratios: 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. Sit with what that must have felt like to discover. Beauty, the most private and unarguable of experiences, turns out to have arithmetic inside it. Something you feel in your chest can be written down as a fraction. And if that is true of music, the Pythagoreans reasoned, why should it not be true of everything? Perhaps number is not something we impose on the world in order to count it. Perhaps number is what the world is actually made of, the hidden order beneath the surface of things, and the heavens themselves move in ratios, producing a music too vast and constant for human ears to notice. They called it the harmony of the spheres, and the idea proved so seductive that it ran through European thought for 2,000 years. When Kepler worked out the orbits of the planets in the 17th century, he was consciously searching for the music the Pythagoreans had promised him. He believed, to the end of his life, that he had found it. Now travel north, up the coast and back across the Aegean, to the city of Ephesus, and to a man who despised almost everybody. Heraclitus came from an aristocratic family and gave up his hereditary position to his brother so that he could think undisturbed. He wrote a book, of which about 100 fragments survive, and even in antiquity, people found it so difficult that they nicknamed him the Obscure. He seems to have wanted it that way. He wrote in compressed, glittering sentences that behave less like arguments than like riddles left on a doorstep. His central perception is one of the great sentences in human thought, and you have probably met a version of it. You cannot step into the same river twice. Look at what that little observation does once you let it move. The river has a name. It has a place on a map. It is the same river you swam in as a child. And yet not one drop of the water that made it a river then is anywhere near this valley now. The thing you are calling a river is not an object at all. It is a pattern that persists while its contents are entirely replaced. And then, if you follow it, the thought comes for you. Because you are that too. The atoms in your body are on their way through you. Your cells are being rebuilt around you while you sleep tonight. Every 7 years or so, most of the material you consist of has been exchanged for other material. And yet you wake each morning and answer to the same name, and remember a childhood that happened to a body that no longer exists. Heraclitus saw this 2,500 years ago without a microscope, purely by watching a river and thinking honestly about what he saw. Everything flows, he said. What appears to be a thing is really a process that is currently holding its shape. And then, in a mountain town in southern Italy, a man arrived at exactly the opposite conclusion and pushed it so far that he ended up denying the world entirely. Parmenides wrote a poem, and in it, a goddess takes him on a journey and explains that there are two paths, the way of truth and the way of opinion. The way of opinion is what your senses tell you, that things move and change and come into being and pass away. The way of truth is what reason tells you when you follow it without flinching. And reason, he argues, tells you that nothing can come from nothing, that what is cannot have become, that change would require something to pass from being to not being, and that not being cannot be spoken of or thought of at all. Therefore, he concluded, being is one, unchanging, whole, without beginning or end, like a perfect sphere. And everything you see, the river, the fire, the birds, your own hands, is illusion. So here they are, awake in the same century, in different corners of the same sea. One saying that reality is number, one saying that reality is flow, one saying that reality is a single motionless sphere, and your eyes are lying to you. They cannot all be right, they may all be wrong, and still, each of them left something we have never given back. The idea that nature has a mathematical structure, the idea that identity persists through change, the idea that reason might overrule the senses. These are not antique curiosities. They are the load-bearing walls of everything that came afterwards. The night is deepening now. The lamps are guttering in Croton and Ephesus and Elea, and those difficult, brilliant men are asleep like everyone else. Let us go back across the water to Athens, where the sky is beginning to pale slightly in the east over the mountains, though dawn is still hours away. In a stonemason's house on the edge of the city, a boy has just been born with an ugly face and an extraordinary mind. He will never write a word, and he will change everything. Athens, in the middle of the 5th century before our era, in the hour when the marketplace is at its fullest. The Agora is a broad open space at the foot of the Acropolis, and it is not beautiful in the way we imagine ancient Athens to have been. It is a working square. There are money changers at trestle tables and fishmongers shouting prices, and a man selling second-hand furniture. There are colonnades along the edges where people shelter from the sun, and under one of them, a group of men have been standing for 2 hours, arguing. At the center of the group is a short, heavy-set man in his 50s, wearing a cloak that has clearly been worn every day for years. He is barefoot. He is barefoot in winter too, which people notice and comment on. His face is famously ugly by the standards of a city obsessed with physical beauty, a snub nose, wide nostrils, protruding eyes. And he makes jokes about it himself, comparing his own features favorably to those of a statue, on the grounds that his nostrils are better positioned for smelling. This is Socrates, son of Sophroniscus, and he is the most annoying man in Athens. Notice what he is doing, because it is the whole of his method, and it looks like nothing at all. He is not lecturing, he has no school, takes no fees, and holds no position. He is standing in a public square asking a man a question, listening carefully to the answer, and then asking another question about that answer. The man he is talking to today is a general, a respected soldier, and the question Socrates asked was simply this: what is courage? The general answered easily. Courage is standing firm in the line of battle and not running away. Socrates agreed that this was certainly courageous. but wondered aloud about the soldiers who win by pretending to retreat and then turning. Are they cowards? No, said the general. They are not. So courage cannot only mean standing firm, the general adjusted. Courage is a kind of endurance of the soul. Socrates wondered whether foolish endurance, a man who holds a position that will certainly kill him and achieve nothing, is really courage, or something else. The general adjusted again, and an hour later, this respected soldier, who has genuinely been brave many times in his life, discovers that he cannot say what the thing is that he has been doing. Now the crucial part, and the part most easily misunderstood. Socrates did not then explain the answer. He did not have one. The conversation simply ends in shared bewilderment, and the two men part with the question hanging in the air like the smell of the sea. This is the strangest thing about him, and it made people furious. The famous line that comes down to us, though the wording is Plato's, is that he was the wisest man in Athens only because he alone knew that he knew nothing. There is a story about the oracle at Delphi being asked whether anyone was wiser than Socrates, and answering no, and Socrates spending years going from expert to expert, trying to prove the oracle wrong, and discovering that the poets could not explain their own poems, the politicians could not define the justice they administered, and the craftsmen, who genuinely did know their crafts, assumed on that basis that they understood everything else as well. And here is what I want you to see about him, because it is easy to lose the human being inside the marble bust. He was not a remote figure. He fought as a heavy infantryman in 3 campaigns, and the accounts we have describe him walking calmly through a chaotic retreat, so composed that the enemy left him alone. He could outdrink anyone at a dinner party and go home sober at dawn while everyone else lay under the table. He was married to a woman named Xanthippe, who has been unfairly caricatured for 2,000 years as a shrew, when the plain fact is that she was married to a man who did not earn money and stood in the square all day, asking strangers what virtue was. He loved Athens, he almost never left it, and he genuinely liked people. That matters, and it separates him from every imitator who has ever used his method as a weapon. He was not humiliating that general. He was not scoring points, though the young men who followed him around certainly enjoyed watching. He believed something quite specific and, in its way, tender, that nobody does wrong knowingly, that we act badly out of confusion about what is actually good for us, and that if a person could genuinely see what was best, they would do it. On that view, every muddled conversation in the agora is a small act of rescue. He believed something else too, which was more radical than anything the Milesians had proposed about water and air. He believed the important questions were not about the stars, they were about how to live. Athens had by then produced remarkable thinkers about nature, but Socrates turned the whole enterprise inwards. What is justice? What is piety? What is friendship? What is the good life? And how would you know if you were living it? He argued that a human being has a soul, by which he meant something closer to the true self than to a ghost, and that this soul can be in good or bad condition, and that its condition matters more than money, more than reputation, more even than the body. Take care of your soul first, he told them. Everything else is negotiable. He wrote none of this down. That was deliberate. He believed philosophy was something that happens between two people who are actually present to each other, a living exchange in which the questioner can push back and adjust. A book, he said, always tells you the same thing no matter what you ask it. Everything we have of him comes second-hand, mostly from 2 of his followers, Plato and Xenophon, who portray him rather differently, and from a comic playwright, Aristophanes, who put him on stage in a basket, suspended above the theater, studying the clouds, being ridiculous. Scholars have spent centuries trying to find the real man among the 3 portraits, and the honest position is that we cannot be certain. The most influential figure in the history of Western thought reaches us only as a reflection in other people's writing. The sun is going down over the agora now. The stalls are closing, exactly as they were closing in that little harbor town where we began. The men around Socrates drift away towards their homes. He stays a while, in the emptying square, in that long gold light that comes just before dusk in the Mediterranean, and makes stone look like honey. He is nearly 70. Athens has been through a great deal in his lifetime. A war lasting a generation, lost. A plague that killed perhaps a quarter of the city. A brief and brutal oligarchy, imposed by the victors, and a restored democracy, still raw and frightened, and looking for someone to blame for how far the city has fallen. Somewhere in the streets behind him, 3 citizens are preparing an indictment. The charges will be impiety, failing to acknowledge the gods of the city, introducing new divinities, and corrupting the young. The year is 399 before the Common Era. A jury of 500 ordinary Athenians will be selected by lot, and they will listen to him for 3 hours. Rest for a moment before we go into that courtroom. Let your breathing slow. The square is empty now, and the swallows are turning over the rooftops, and the man in the worn cloak is finally walking home. The court sits in the open air, in a building at the edge of the agora, and the jury is enormous. 500 men, or thereabouts, all of them citizens over 30, all of them chosen by lottery from those who put their names forward that morning. Most are ordinary Athenians, farmers from the countryside around the city, potters, sailors, men who have come partly because jurors were paid, and the pay mattered if you were old or your land was poor. They sit on wooden benches. There is no judge. There are no lawyers. There is no appeal. A water clock measures out the speeches, and when the water runs out, you stop. The prosecution speaks first. Then Socrates rises to defend himself, and what he says over the next 3 hours is either the bravest speech in the history of philosophy or an act of extraordinary self-destruction, and the truth is probably that it was both. He does not plead. It was ordinary practice in an Athenian court to weep, to bring your children forward, to appeal to the jury's pity, and he explicitly refuses to do any of it, saying it would be shameful to treat the court as though it were an audience to be flattered, rather than a body seeking the truth. He does not soften his life's work. He compares himself, in Plato's account, to a gadfly sent to sting a large and sluggish horse into wakefulness, and tells the jury that the city may find it easy to swat him, and will then go back to sleep for the rest of its life. And then he says the sentence that has outlived the entire civilization that condemned him. The unexamined life, he tells them, is not worth living. Think about how that must have sounded in that room, not as a poster on a wall, as a claim made to 500 working men, most of whom had never examined anything in the philosophical sense, and had no leisure to, that a life like theirs was not worth having. It is possible to admire the sentence and still understand why the room did not warm to it. They vote by dropping bronze tokens into urns, 280 for guilt, 221 against. A shift of 30 men, and he goes home. Now comes the second stage, and this is the moment historians return to again and again. Athenian law did not set a fixed penalty for these charges. The prosecution proposed death. Socrates was invited to propose an alternative, and the jury would choose between the two. Everyone in the room, including his accusers, expected him to propose exile. It is very likely they would have accepted it. Nobody particularly wanted to execute a 70-year-old man. They wanted him gone, or at least quiet. He proposed instead that the city should give him free meals for life in the public hall, the honor normally reserved for Olympic victors, on the grounds that he had done Athens more good than any athlete. You can almost hear the room. His friends, appalled, hurriedly persuade him to name a fine instead, and offer to pay it themselves. But the damage is done. The jury votes again, and this time the margin is wider than the guilty verdict itself. More men vote for his death than voted for his conviction. He is taken to the prison, which archaeologists believe they have located just southwest of the Agora, a modest building of small rooms. And because a sacred ship has just departed on an annual voyage to Delos, and no execution may take place while it is at sea, he waits there for about a month. During that month, his friends arrange everything necessary for his escape. The guards can be bribed. There are cities that would take him. Crito comes to him before dawn and lays out the whole plan, and adds the argument that will hurt most, that Socrates is abandoning his sons, and that people will say his friends were too mean or too cowardly to save him. Socrates refuses. His reasoning, as Plato gives it to us, is that he has lived his whole life under the laws of Athens, has taken every benefit they offered, has never left the city though he was free to, and that to break them now, purely because their verdict has gone against him, would be to say that the law binds us only when it suits us. He will not answer injustice with injustice. He would rather suffer a wrong than commit one. On the last day, his friends come early and find that his wife Xanthippe has been there since dawn, holding their youngest child. She cries out when she sees them, saying this is the last time he will talk with his friends, and Socrates asks that she be taken home. It is the smallest detail in the whole story, and for me, always the one that lands hardest. Behind the philosophy there was a household. There were children who would not remember him. Towards evening, the man who prepares the poison arrives, apologizing, saying he has found Socrates the noblest and gentlest of all the men who have come to that place. Socrates asks whether he may pour a libation from the cup to the gods, and is told there is only enough prepared. He drinks it without hesitating. He is told to walk until his legs feel heavy, and then to lie down. The numbness rises slowly. His friends break down, and he chides them gently for making a scene, saying he sent the women away precisely to avoid this. And then, when the cold has reached his waist, he says one last thing, an instruction to pay a debt of a cockerel to Asclepius, the god of healing. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained it. You offered a cockerel to Asclepius when you had been cured of something. The most common reading is that he meant death itself was the cure, the release of the soul from the long illness of the body. Others have argued for other meanings, and one modern scholar has suggested he was simply remembering, in his last lucid moment, an actual debt he actually owed. Perhaps that is the most Socratic possibility of all. Even at the end, an ordinary obligation, properly discharged. Let the room go quiet around that for a moment. And here is the strangest turn of all. Socrates, who wrote nothing, whose entire method was a live conversation that could not be reproduced, who was killed at 70 with no school and no institution and no book to his name, became the most influential teacher in the history of Western thought. Every philosophical school in Greece, for the next several hundred years, claimed descent from him. Stoics, Cynics, Sceptics, Platonists, all of them traced their lineage back to that barefoot man in the market. Because sitting in the courtroom that day, watching all of it, was a young aristocrat of about 27 or 28, with a talent for wrestling and poetry, who had been intending to enter politics. He never did. He went away instead, and began to write the conversations down, and in doing so, invented something that had not existed before: philosophy as literature, ideas dramatized as living speech between named human beings in real places. His name was Aristocles, though nobody calls him that. They called him Plato, which seems to have been a nickname, possibly meaning broad, possibly referring to his shoulders, possibly to his forehead. We are going to his garden now, outside the city walls, where the ground is sacred to a forgotten hero, and the olive trees are very old. Come slowly. It is well past midnight in our long Greek night, and the road out of Athens is dark and quiet. A little way beyond the city gate, along a road lined with tombs and monuments, there is a grove of olive trees so old that Athenian law protected them individually. The ground is dedicated to a legendary hero named Academus, and because of him, the place is called the Academy. There is a gymnasium here, and running tracks, and a stream, and long avenues of plane trees planted for shade. Athenians have come here to exercise for generations. And around the year 387, before our era, a man in his early 40s buys a property nearby and begins to gather people. He has been away for years. After his teacher's execution, Plato left Athens and traveled, possibly to Egypt, certainly to Italy and Sicily, where he encountered Pythagoreans and their conviction that reality is mathematical. He returned changed, and what he founds in this olive grove is something new. Not a religious brotherhood like Pythagoras' order, not a fee-charging school of public speaking like those his rivals ran, but an institution devoted to research and discussion, where mathematics, astronomy, law, and philosophy were pursued together by people living in shared inquiry. It lasted, in one form or another, for the better part of 900 years. Every university you have ever heard of is, at some level of descent, a grandchild of this garden. And the word academy, which appears on school gates and film award ceremonies all over the world, is really the name of a minor Athenian hero nobody remembers, whose sacred wood happened to be for sale. Now, what did Plato actually think? Let me approach it the way he would have wanted, which is through a problem rather than a doctrine. Think of a circle. Not any particular circle, but the circle geometry talks about, every point exactly the same distance from the center. You know what that is. You can reason about it, prove things about it, and be certain of your conclusions in a way you can never be certain about anything you see. Now try to find one. Draw a circle. Under magnification, the line wobbles. Use the finest instruments ever built, and the edge is still made of atoms, ragged at the scale that matters. The coin, the wheel, the full moon, none of them are circles. They are approximations. Every circle that has ever existed in the physical world falls short of the thing you were thinking about, and yet you were clearly thinking about something, because you can prove theorems about it that hold with absolute precision. So where is the circle? That question, in one form or another, drove Plato's entire philosophy. His answer was that the objects of thought are real, more real than the objects of sight, and that they exist independently of any particular example. He called them forms. There is the form of circle, and every round thing in the world participates in it, resembles it, falls short of it. And crucially, this applies not only to shapes but to everything worth arguing about. There is justice itself, and every just law is a partial, cloudy copy of it. There is beauty itself, of which every beautiful face and building and piece of music is a fleeting instance. And notice what it costs. It splits the world in two, and it makes the world you are lying in tonight, the one with the pillow and the window and the sounds of the street, into the lesser half. Copies, shadows, approximations. It is one of the most consequential moves in Western thought, and its influence on later religion and philosophy is difficult to overstate. His student Aristotle, whom we will meet shortly, thought it was a mistake, and we will hear his objection in its place. Plato also asked the question that his teacher had died for. What is justice, and how should a human community be arranged? His answer, in the long dialogue we call the Republic, is uncomfortable and endlessly discussed. He proposes a city ruled not by the wealthy, not by the well-born, and emphatically not by the majority, but by those who have spent decades in study and have come to understand the form of the good, guardians who own no property, have no private families, and take no pleasure in power. They must be compelled to rule, he says, precisely because anyone who wants to rule is thereby unfit. It is easy to read that as an argument for authoritarianism, and it has been read that way, sharply, by serious critics in the 20th century. It is also possible to read it, as many scholars do, as an extended analogy about the individual soul, since Plato explicitly says the city is written large, what the person is written small, with reason, spirit, and appetite arranged in the same relation. The safest thing to say is that he was a man whose beloved teacher had been voted to death by an assembly of ordinary citizens, and that his lifelong skepticism about the wisdom of crowds has an obvious wound at its root. But before we leave the garden, there are two things about Plato that people rarely mention, and both of them soften the marble a little. The first is that he was funny, genuinely, deliberately funny. The dialogues are full of teasing, of characters who interrupt and sulk and show off, of a young man arriving late and out of breath, of Socrates flirting outrageously with the argument as much as with the boy. One dialogue, the symposium, takes place at a drinking party where everyone agrees to make a speech about love, and it contains a story, put in the mouth of the comic playwright Aristophanes, that human beings were originally spherical creatures with 4 arms and 4 legs who were cut in half by Zeus, and that love is the search for one's missing half. It is a joke and a myth and, somehow, still the most quoted account of longing in Western literature, which is why his most famous idea comes to us not as an argument, but as a story. He tells it in the middle of the Republic, and it may be the single most powerful image ever produced by a human mind. It is about a cave, and prisoners, and firelight, and what happens to a person who gets out. And tonight, I am going to tell it to you slowly, the way it was probably first told, as a story after dark. So settle down properly now. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There is nothing to work out, nothing to analyze. Just listen. Once, there were some people who lived in a cave. Once, there were some people who lived in a cave. They had lived there since they were small children, so long that none of them could remember arriving. The cave went a long way back into the hillside, and at the far end of it, deep in the rock, the people sat in a row, facing the back wall. They could not turn around. There were fastenings at their ankles and around their necks, arranged so gently and so long ago that the prisoners no longer thought of them as fastenings. This was simply the shape of a life. You sat, and you looked at the wall in front of you, and the wall was all there was. Behind them, some way back, there was a fire. It had been burning as long as anyone could remember, and it filled the cave with a dim, unsteady orange light. And between the fire and the prisoners, there was a low wall, like the screen a puppeteer stands behind. Along that wall, people walked back and forth carrying things. Statues of animals, figures of men and women, carved from wood and stone, vessels, tools, all of it held up above the screen, so that the firelight threw the shapes forward, onto the back wall of the cave, where the prisoners were looking. So all their lives, the prisoners had watched shadows. A tall shadow would cross the wall from left to right, and one of the carriers behind them would say something, and the sound would bounce off the stone and seem to come from the shadow itself. And the prisoners, who had never seen anything else, gave the shadows names. They learned the order in which the shapes usually came. They became skilled at it. Some of them were remarkably good, able to predict which shadow would appear next, and these were honored by the others and given prizes and considered wise. They were not stupid. They were not being foolish. There was nothing else in their experience to compare the shadows to. If you had told them that they were watching reflections of carved objects lit by a fire, the words would have meant nothing at all. The shadows were not their idea of reality. The shadows were reality. There was no other candidate. Now suppose that one of them is released. It happens without warning. The fastenings come away, and the person is made to stand up for the first time, and to turn around. And it hurts. That is the part of the story people forget. The first experience of freedom is pain. The neck is stiff, from a lifetime of facing one way. The eyes, which have only ever known dim shadows, are turned towards the fire, and the fire is far too bright. Everything blurs, and when the released prisoner is shown the actual objects being carried along the wall, the real statues, the real vessels, they cannot make sense of them at all. They are dazzled and confused, and the shapes they can no longer see clearly on the wall behind them seem, by comparison, far more definite and true. But suppose they are not left there. Suppose they are taken further, up the long slope towards the mouth of the cave, and out, into daylight. At first they can see nothing whatsoever. The world is white, it is unbearable, and they want to go back, and they would go back if they could. So they wait. And gradually, over a long time, the eyes begin to adjust. They look at shadows first, because shadows are all they have ever been trained on, and shadows outside are the easiest thing to bear. Then reflections in water, then, eventually, the objects themselves. A tree, a cup, another person's face, actually lit, actually there, with color in it. Then at night, because night is gentler, they look up and see the moon and the stars, and understand for the first time that there is a sky. And finally, one morning, they are able to look towards the sun itself, not a reflection of it, not its light on a stone wall, but the thing itself, the source of every shadow they ever studied, the reason there was ever anything to see at all. And here, Plato says something quietly devastating. The freed prisoner would count themselves happy for the change, and would feel sorry for the others, and they would no longer care at all about the honors down there, the prizes for guessing which shadow came next, the reputation of being wise about the wall. They would rather be a servant in the daylight than a king in the cave. But the story does not end there, and this is the part that turns it from a lovely image into something with an edge in it. The freed prisoner goes back. They go back down the slope, into the dark. And now the trouble begins in earnest, because eyes that have adjusted to sunlight cannot see in a dim cave. Coming down, the returning prisoner stumbles. They cannot make out the shadows anymore. They are hopeless at the game they used to be good at, and when the contests are held, they lose to people who never left. And the others watch this and draw the obvious conclusion. Going up there ruins your eyes. That person went out and came back damaged. And if anyone tried to release them and lead them up the same road, Plato writes, the prisoners would kill him if they could get their hands on him. That last line was written by a man whose teacher had been executed by his own city for asking too many questions. Let it settle. Do not work at it. Let it lie there in the dark with you. Because the story does something unusual. Everyone who hears it immediately identifies with the freed prisoner, and that reaction is worth noticing gently, because the whole force of the parable depends on the fact that we are the ones in the row. The people watching the wall are not idiots. They are careful, they are skilled, and they are looking at exactly the evidence available to them. The trouble is not that they are reasoning badly. The trouble is the position of the chairs. He meant it, at least in part, as an image of education. He says as much. Education is not, on this view, pouring knowledge into an empty vessel, which was the standard metaphor then, as it often is now. It is turning a person around. The capacity to see was always there. What has to change is the direction the whole soul is facing. But at this hour, in the dark, I would offer you the quietest reading, and then let it go. Everyone is in the cave about something, not about everything, and not stupidly. Everyone carries a few beliefs, absorbed so early and so completely that they have never once appeared as beliefs, only as the way things are. Ideas about what a life must look like, about what would make us acceptable, about what we are permitted to want. They arrived in childhood, from the shapes moving on the wall, and they have never been examined because they have never been visible. Plato's suggestion is simply that the fastenings are not as tight as they feel, that the position of the chairs is not a law of nature, and that the long, awkward, painful business of turning round, at any age, in any life, is the only thing that could ever be meant by waking up. The fire has burned down now in that old story. The cave is quiet. Let us leave it, and go out into the morning air of the 4th century, where a young man from the northern edge of the Greek world has just arrived at Plato's academy. He is 17. He will stay for 20 years, and he will disagree with almost everything you have just heard. His father was a doctor. That single fact explains a great deal about Aristotle. and it is where any honest account of him should begin. He grew up in Stagira, a small town on the northern coast, in a household where the family trade was the human body, and where you learned early that if you want to know how a thing works, you look at it, carefully, many times, and write down what you actually see, rather than what you expect. He arrives at the academy at 17 and stays for 20 years, until Plato dies. 2 decades of daily argument with the finest mind in Greece. And at the end of it he walks away, holding a completely different picture of reality, which may be the greatest compliment a teacher ever received. His objection to the forms is beautifully simple, and you can feel its weight if you hold both pictures at once. Plato says, the perfect circle exists in a realm beyond the physical world, and the round things here participate in it. Aristotle asks what that participation actually amounts to. What is the mechanism? Where is this realm? And, more sharply, why does making a second world explain the first one? If you cannot account for a horse, you have not improved matters by inventing an ideal horse elsewhere and then needing to explain that too. His alternative is to bring the forms down to earth. The form of a thing, he argues, is not off in another dimension. It is in the thing. It is the organizing principle that makes this particular arrangement of flesh a horse rather than a heap. Form and matter are 2 aspects of one object, inseparable in practice, distinguishable only in thought, which means that if you want to understand reality, you do not turn away from the physical world towards abstraction. You go and look at it, closely, all of it. And that is exactly what he did, on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. He wrote on logic, and effectively invented the formal study of it. He wrote on physics, on the heavens, on meteorology, on the soul, on memory and dreams and sleep. He wrote on the parts of animals, the movement of animals, the generation of animals. He wrote on ethics, politics, rhetoric and poetry. He collected and analyzed the constitutions of 158 Greek city-states, of which only one survives, rediscovered on papyrus in Egypt in the 19th century. He classified hundreds of species. He described the development of a chick embryo by opening eggs at successive stages, day after day, and recording what he found. Some of his biology was wrong. Plenty of it was startlingly right, and dismissed for centuries, because later readers assumed he must have been mistaken. He described a species of catfish where the male guards the eggs, and nobody believed it until the 19th century, when a naturalist confirmed it and the fish was named in his honor. He noticed that dolphins bear live young and suckle them, and grouped them apart from fish. He observed the octopus using a specialized arm in reproduction, which was not confirmed again until the 1840s. Then there is ethics, and here he asks the question that Socrates asked, and answers it in a way that has never stopped being useful. What is the good life for a human being? He begins by noticing that almost everything we pursue for the sake of something else. Money for what it buys. Exercise for health. Health so we can do things. And he asks whether there is anything we want purely for itself at the end of the chain. There is, he says, and everyone already agrees on the name for it, even though nobody agrees on what it consists of. The Greek word is eudaimonia, and it is usually translated as happiness, which is misleading, because it does not mean a pleasant feeling. It means something closer to flourishing, or a life going well as a whole, the kind of judgment you can only really make about a life from a distance. And what makes a life go well? Not pleasure, he says, though pleasure accompanies a good life rather than causing it. Not honor, because honor depends on other people and can be taken away. Not wealth, obviously, since wealth is purely instrumental. His answer is that a thing flourishes by performing its characteristic function excellently, and the characteristic function of a human being involves the exercise of reason. So a flourishing human life is one lived in accordance with excellence, over a complete life, with enough of the external goods that misfortune does not crush it. Then comes the most practically useful idea he ever had, and it is the one I would offer you tonight if you take only one thing from this chapter. Virtue, he argues, is a skill, not a rule. You do not become brave by memorizing the definition of bravery. You become brave by doing brave things, until bravery is what you are like. Character is built by repetition, exactly as a lyre player is built by playing the lyre. We are what we repeatedly do, and the person who is trained well eventually finds the right action easy and enjoyable, which is the mark of genuine excellence as opposed to gritted teeth self-control. And every virtue, he suggests, sits between two failures. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between meanness and extravagance, honesty between deceit and a kind of tactless brutality that mistakes cruelty for candor. There is no formula for finding the middle. It shifts with the person and the circumstance, and locating it is the work of practical wisdom, which is itself a skill developed by experience. After Plato died, Aristotle left Athens. He spent time in Asia Minor and on Lesbos, and then received an invitation from the king of Macedon to tutor his son. He accepted and taught the boy for several years, and we will come to that boy later tonight, because he did not remain a boy for long, and the world was never the same afterwards. And then, in his 60s, politics caught up with him. His Macedonian connections made him suspect in an Athens that resented Macedonian power, and a charge of impiety was raised. He did not stay to fight it. He withdrew to Chalcis, remarking, according to a later tradition, that he would not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy. He died there within the year. The night is very deep now. We have been walking through philosophy for hours, and I want to take you somewhere softer. Because all this time, in every one of these cities, in the houses and on the hillsides, ordinary people were living inside a very different way of understanding the world. Older, stranger, full of stories about a family of immortals living on a mountain in the north, who quarreled and fell in love and interfered constantly in human affairs. Let your body get heavier. We are going up to Olympus. Before we go any further, let me say something carefully, because it matters, and it is almost always got wrong. There are three different things that tend to get bundled together under the heading of Greek mythology, and they are not the same at all. The first is the stories, the poems of Homer and Hesiod, the plays, the myths as literature. These were never a Bible. Greek poets felt free to alter them, contradict them, and reinvent them, and different regions told incompatible versions of the same tale, without anyone feeling a crisis of faith. The second is the religion, which is what people actually did. Sacrifice, festival, procession, libation, prayer at a household altar. This was not primarily about belief in the modern sense at all. It was about maintaining a relationship, doing the correct things at the correct times to keep the community in good standing with powers that could help or harm it. A Greek could privately doubt a great deal about the gods and remain entirely pious, so long as the rites were kept. The third is what we can establish historically, which is inscriptions, temple accounts, excavated altars, bones from sacrifices, dedications left by real people whose names we know. So, Mount Olympus in the north of Greece, nearly 3,000 meters high, with cloud around the summit most days of the year. That is a real mountain, and you can climb it, and it is where they said the gods lived. Zeus first, because everyone begins with Zeus. He is the sky and the thunderbolt, the god of hospitality and of oaths, the one who guarantees that a stranger at your door will be fed rather than robbed. In a world of small communities and dangerous roads, that was not a minor portfolio. It was the rule that made travel possible. And he is a serial adulterer whose wife spends most of mythology taking revenge on his lovers and their children. Modern readers often find this shocking, but sit with the shape of it for a moment, because it is doing something. The Greeks did not claim their gods were morally perfect. Their gods are powerful, deathless, and entirely capable of pettiness, jealousy, favoritism, and rage. They are what human beings would be if human beings had unlimited power and no consequences. That is not a failure of religious imagination. It is a rather unflinching piece of psychology, and it means Greek myth has room for something later traditions had to work harder to accommodate. The plain fact that the world is not always just, that the innocent suffer, and that the powers governing existence are not reliably on your side. Athena next, born from Zeus's head, fully armed, after he swallowed her mother. She is wisdom, but never abstract wisdom. She is skill applied. She is the goddess of strategy rather than slaughter, of weaving, of pottery, of shipbuilding, of the olive tree. The city of Athens is named for her, or she for it, and her temple on the Acropolis is the Parthenon, a detail worth keeping. The Parthenon housed a statue of Athena nearly 12 meters tall, made of gold and ivory over a wooden frame, and the gold on it was deliberately made removable, so that in an emergency, the city could take it off and use it as treasury reserves. That is a very Athenian arrangement. Even their most sacred object was also, quietly, the national bank. Apollo is light, music, poetry, prophecy, and healing, and also, disconcertingly, plague. The god who cures is the god who sends the arrows of sickness. The Greeks were content to have both in one figure, which is more sophisticated than it sounds, since the thing that heals and the thing that harms are so often the same substance in different quantities. His sister Artemis is the wild, untamed country, hunting, wild animals, and the protection of young girls before marriage. She is fiercely solitary, and she does not forgive intrusion. Poseidon is the sea and, strangely to us, earthquakes and horses. In a country of unstable ground and a people whose lives depended entirely on the water, he was the god you most needed to keep sweet. Sailors poured wine into the sea for him before a voyage, and if you have ever watched a storm come across open water, you will understand exactly why they thought something enormous and moody lived under it. Hades is not a devil, and this is one of the most common misunderstandings. He is the ruler of the dead, but he is not evil, and he does not tempt anyone. The underworld he governs is not a place of punishment for most people. It is simply where the dead go, a grey, dim, diminished existence. In Homer, the ghost of the greatest of all heroes says he would rather be a landless laborer among the living than king of all the dead. That is a bleak view of what comes after, and it is worth noticing how much it raises the value of this life. If there is no glorious afterlife, then whatever meaning exists must be made here. Hermes is the messenger, the god of boundaries and crossings, of travelers, merchants, thieves, and language. And it is Hermes who guides souls down to Hades. He is playful, quick, morally flexible, and he shows up wherever one world meets another. And Dionysus is the one who breaks the rules. He is wine, ecstasy, theater, and the loss of self. His worship involved dancing to exhaustion, music, masks, and a temporary dissolution of the ordinary social order, in which respectable citizens became, briefly, something other than themselves. In a culture that prized moderation and self-command above almost everything, Dionysus was the necessary release valve, the acknowledgement that a human being cannot be reasonable all the time, and that something in us needs occasionally to be let out under supervision. And here is one of my favorite facts about the ancient world, hiding inside that. Greek theater, the origin of all Western drama, comedy, and tragedy alike, began as a religious festival for Dionysus. Those plays were not entertainment in our sense. They were rites. Tens of thousands of citizens sat in an open-air theater in daylight and watched stories of catastrophe and moral ruin, and the experience was understood to be good for the city's soul. Now, what did people actually believe? It varied enormously, which is exactly what you would expect across many centuries and hundreds of communities. There is real evidence of intense personal devotion. of people leaving offerings at shrines to thank a god for a recovery from illness or a safe voyage, with their names inscribed. There is also evidence of skepticism, and it goes back a long way. Xenophanes in the 6th century pointed out dryly that Ethiopians made their gods dark-skinned, and Thracians made theirs red-haired and blue-eyed, and that if cattle and horses had hands and could draw, they would draw gods that looked like cattle and horses. There were also the mystery cults, and they are the great tantalizing silence in the record. At Eleusis, near Athens, initiates went through a ritual whose central experience they were forbidden to reveal, on pain of death, and the astonishing thing is that in over 1,000 years, essentially nobody did. We know the procession happened, we know something was shown, something was said, something was done. We know participants came away claiming they no longer feared death, and we do not know what happened in that hall. It is one of the best-kept secrets in human history. The stars are wheeling over Olympus now. The mountain has its cloud on, and down in the valleys and along the coasts, the ordinary business of an ordinary life is going on, which is where I want to take you next, because we have spent a long time among gods and philosophers, and I would like you to see the houses. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the bed. There is nothing urgent left in this night. Before the houses, one detour, because there is a place we cannot leave out, and it is best visited at night. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, in a natural amphitheater of grey cliffs, sits Delphi. Even now, standing there in ruins, it is one of the most atmospheric places on Earth. Eagles turn on the thermals below you. The valley falls away for 1,000 meters into a sea of olive trees, and it is quiet in a way that makes people lower their voices without deciding to. The Greeks believed this was the center of the world. The story went that Zeus released 2 eagles from opposite ends of the earth, and they met here, and a carved stone called the omphalos, the navel, marked the spot. For roughly 1,000 years, people came to this mountain to ask questions. The answers came through a woman. She was called the Pythia, a priestess drawn from the local population, and the sources indicate that in the temple's earlier centuries, she was young, and that later, the position was held by an older woman, often past 50. She would purify herself at a spring, and then sit on a tripod in an inner chamber, and there she would speak. What happened in that chamber has been argued about since antiquity. Ancient writers, including Plutarch, who actually served as a priest at Delphi, describe a sweet-smelling vapor rising from the ground. For most of the 20th century, scholars dismissed this as legend, since early excavations found no chasm. Then, from the 1990s, a team including a geologist, an archaeologist and a chemist reported that 2 fault lines intersect directly beneath the temple, and that the local limestone contains hydrocarbons, and that gases, including ethylene, could plausibly have risen through the fissures. Ethylene, in small doses, produces a euphoric, floating, trance-like state. The finding remains debated among specialists, and I want to be honest about that, rather than hand you a tidy answer. But the possibility that the most famous religious institution of the ancient world sat on a geological quirk is one of the more remarkable propositions in archaeology. The responses themselves were famously ambiguous, and this was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. The most quoted example concerns a king who asked whether he should attack the Persians, and was told that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. He attacked. The empire he destroyed was his own. That story, whether or not it happened as told, contains the whole psychology of the place. The oracle rarely told you what to do. It gave you something you had to interpret, and the interpretation was yours, which meant that the responsibility remained yours as well. And carved at the temple were short maxims that have outlived everything around them. Know thyself. Nothing in excess. The first of those 2 in particular has echoed through every century since. It was already ancient when Socrates made it the center of his life's work. Now come down from the mountain, and let me take you to one more sacred place before we go home to the houses, because it explains something about how these quarrelsome, independent, endlessly warring communities managed to think of themselves as one people at all. In the western Peloponnese, in a green valley between two rivers, is Olympia. Every 4 years, from a traditional starting date of 776 before our era, messengers went out from this sanctuary to every corner of the Greek world, announcing a sacred truce. For the period of the festival, and the travel to and from it, wars were suspended, and the roads were safe. Athletes and spectators came from Sicily, from the Black Sea, from North Africa, from anywhere Greek was spoken. They competed naked, oiled, in a stadium that held tens of thousands, in running, wrestling, boxing, the pentathlon, the chariot races. There was no second place. There was no prize money at the games themselves. The victor received a wreath of wild olive, cut from a sacred tree with a golden sickle by a boy with both parents living. An olive wreath, that was it. Married women were forbidden to attend, which is one of the sharper reminders that this world was not ours. Unmarried women appear to have been permitted, and women could win an Olympic victory, though only in the chariot events, where the prize went to the owner of the team rather than the driver. A Spartan princess named Cynisca did exactly that, twice, and had a monument erected to say so. The games ran for over 1,000 years. They finally ended in the 4th century of our era, when a Christian emperor suppressed pagan festivals. And then, in 1896, they were revived in Athens by people consciously reaching back across 1,500 years to pick up something the ancient world had put down. This is worth resting on, as the night carries you further down. In a world without weekends, without holidays as we understand them, the festival was the structure that gave a year its shape. It was the point at which a person stopped being a farmer or a potter and became, for a few days, part of something with a history longer than any life. The sanctuaries are empty now, in our long night. The oracle is asleep. The stadium at Olympia is a rectangle of grass under the stars, with the stone starting line still in place, worn by feet that stood on it for 1,000 summers. Let us go back to the town where we began, and slip through one of those plain doors into a courtyard, and see how an ordinary family lived. The door is low, and beyond it a short passage opens into a courtyard. This is the heart of a Greek house, and it is open to the sky, a square of stars above you. Rooms arranged around it on the ground floor, a small stone altar in one corner where the family makes its own daily offerings, and a well or a cistern. Everything faces inwards. Whatever the family owns of beauty, a painted vessel, a small statue, a bright textile, lives in here, unseen from the street. There is a room, usually the best one, called the andron, the men's room, where a man of the household entertained his friends at a symposium. That word means, literally, drinking together. Wine was mixed with water in a large bowl, because drinking it neat was considered barbaric and slightly dangerous, and the mixture was decided by whoever was appointed leader for the evening. There would be music, riddles, poetry, competitive speech-making, and a great deal of argument. Plato set his most famous dialogue at exactly such an evening. Women of citizen families spent most of their lives in a different part of the house and a different part of the world. The evidence here is uncomfortable and should not be smoothed over. Athenian women could not vote, could not hold office, could not represent themselves in court, and were legally under the authority of a male guardian throughout their lives. Marriages were arranged, often between a girl in her mid-teens and a man near 30. But it is a mistake to picture that as passivity, and the evidence resists it. Women ran the household economy, which in a pre-industrial world meant managing stores, staff, textile production, and finances. Textile work was an enormous industry, conducted almost entirely by women, and clothing represented serious wealth. Women were central to religious life, holding major priesthoods that carried genuine public authority. The Pythia at Delphi was a woman, and in the countryside, and among poorer families, where hands were needed, The sharp separations of the wealthy household simply could not be maintained. We should be equally clear about slavery. This society ran on it. Perhaps a quarter or more of the population of Athens was enslaved, working in households, workshops, fields, and in the silver mines at Laurion, where conditions were murderous. Some enslaved people in cities worked semi-independently and could sometimes buy their freedom. That does not soften the institution, and no honest account of the glory of Athens can be given without it. The leisure that produced the philosophy was, in part, purchased with other people's lives. Now, the food. It was simpler than you might expect, and it rested on three things: grain, mostly barley, made into flatbread or a kind of porridge; olive oil and wine. Around those came vegetables, pulses, figs, cheese, and fish, for those near the coast, which was most people. Meat was a luxury, and it arrived for many households, chiefly through religious sacrifice, since the animal was killed at the altar and then eaten. That is worth pausing on. For an ordinary Greek, a roast dinner was a religious occasion by definition. The olive deserves its own moment, because it is the foundation of everything here. The tree is astonishing. It grows in thin, rocky soil, where almost nothing else will crop, survives drought, and lives for centuries. Some trees standing in Greece today were rooted before the Renaissance. The harvest came in autumn and early winter, whole families out among the terraces with sticks and nets, and the fruit crushed under a stone wheel, the oil pressed and settled. And the oil was not only food, it was the lamp fuel that lit every evening we have spent together tonight. It was soap, effectively, rubbed on the skin at the gymnasium and scraped off with a curved bronze tool. It was medicine and perfume, and the prize in the Panathenaic Games, awarded in enormous decorated jars. A grove of olive trees was a family's insurance, its pension and its inheritance. Next door, someone is working late in a pottery. Athenian pottery is the reason we know so much about daily life, because the painters decorated the vessels with scenes of everything: weddings, funerals, workshops, drinking parties, women at the loom, children with toys, a boy stealing food, a dog under a chair. It is the closest thing the ancient world has to photography. The technique is one of the great craft achievements of antiquity. The famous black and orange coloring is not paint. It is the same clay, applied as a fine slip, and the difference in color is produced entirely by controlling the air in the kiln through three phases: oxidizing, then reducing with the vents closed and green wood smoking, then oxidizing again. The areas of fine slip vitrify and stay black. The coarser body reoxidizes and returns to red. It took modern researchers a great deal of experiment to reconstruct how it was done. Children in a household like this learn different things depending on wealth and sex. A boy of a comfortable family might go to a teacher for reading, writing, and arithmetic, learn large sections of Homer by heart, be taught the lyre, and spend hours at the wrestling ground, because physical training was considered part of education rather than separate from it. A girl would generally be taught at home, principally the skills of running a household, though we have evidence of literate women, and in Sparta, girls were given athletic training publicly, which the rest of Greece found scandalous. Outside, in the dark, the boats are at their moorings. Greek sailing was mostly coastal and mostly seasonal. Merchants avoided the open sea in winter, watching the stars and the weather to know when the sailing season opened and closed. They navigated by landmarks, by the constellations, by the color of the water and the birds. A ship might carry oil, wine, grain, timber, pottery, and it was cheaper to move goods from one end of the Mediterranean to another by sea than to cart them 50 miles inland. The lamps in the courtyard are almost out now. The family is asleep. Somewhere above, on the hill, that painted temple stands in the dark, holding its colors invisibly until morning. And tomorrow, in a city not far away, several thousand men will walk up a low hill west of the marketplace, sit down on the bare rock, and decide, by raising their hands, what their country is going to do. Rest now. We are almost at the end of the night. It is a low hill, west of the Agora, with a view across to the Acropolis. There is no building on it. There is a rock platform cut into the slope where a speaker stands, and in front of that, a curved open area where the citizens sit on the stone and the earth. That is the whole architecture of the first democracy. No chamber, no benches, no ceiling, weather permitting, and sometimes when it did not. The assembly met around 40 times a year. Any adult male citizen could attend, speak, and vote. Estimates suggest something like 30 to 40,000 men were eligible, and that a typical meeting drew perhaps 6,000, which was also the quorum required for certain decisions. Attendance was so important that officials with a rope dipped in red dye were sent through the agora to sweep loiterers towards the hill, and anyone whose clothes ended up marked could be fined. The herald would open proceedings by asking a question that still deserves to be read slowly. Who wishes to speak? Not which representative, not which party. Who wishes to speak? Any citizen, of any trade or income, could climb onto that platform and address the assembly, and then everyone present would vote, usually by show of hands, and the decision was made. Not recommended. Made. War, peace, treaties, taxation, public works, the appointment and prosecution of officials, all of it decided directly by the people in the open air, that morning. How did this come about? The pivotal figure is Cleisthenes, in the year 508 before the Common Era. Athens had been through decades of aristocratic factionalism and a period of one-family rule, and Cleisthenes, losing a power struggle with a rival, did something unexpected. He took his case to the ordinary people and offered them a system. His central reform sounds technical and was in fact radical. The old political tribes were based on kinship, which meant that voting followed family loyalty, and family loyalty followed the great landowning clans. Cleisthenes abolished them and created 10 new tribes, each one deliberately assembled from villages in 3 different regions: the city, the coast, and the inland. It became impossible for any single tribe to be the private property of one clan or one district, because every tribe contained people who had nothing in common except the arrangement itself. He then created a council of 550 from each tribe, selected by lot, serving for a year, with a limit of 2 terms in a lifetime. The council prepared the business for the assembly, and because it was chosen by lottery and rotated constantly, an extraordinary proportion of the citizen body would serve on it at some point. That is the detail modern readers find hardest to accept, so let me put it plainly. The Athenians thought elections were aristocratic, because elections favor the famous, the wealthy, and the eloquent. For most public offices, they used a lottery instead, on the principle that ordinary citizens are competent to govern, and that any citizen might be called upon. The courts worked the same way. Juries of several hundred, chosen by lot from volunteers each morning, hearing cases in a single day, with no judge and no appeal. There was a machine for the selection, a slab of stone with slots for bronze identity tokens, and a tube of black and white balls, designed so that nobody, including the officials, could predict or influence who would sit. Fragments of these machines survive. It is one of the most touching objects in the study of ancient politics, a piece of engineering built for the single purpose of making corruption impossible. And the ostracism. Once a year, the assembly was asked whether it wished to hold one. If it agreed, the citizens gathered, and each scratched a name on a fragment of broken pottery. If at least 6,000 shards were cast, the man named most often was required to leave Athens for 10 years. He lost no property and suffered no disgrace, and could return afterwards. It was a mechanism for removing a person who had become too powerful, before he could become a tyrant, without a trial and without bloodshed. Thousands of these shards have been excavated. You can see them in the museum in Athens, ordinary broken pieces of household pottery, with names scratched into them in the handwriting of ordinary men. Some are neat, Some are barely literate. And in one deposit, archaeologists found a batch of shards bearing the same name, written by only a handful of different hands, which suggests that somebody was preparing them in advance and handing them out. Even here, at the birth of the thing, someone had already invented electioneering. Now, the flaws. And they are not small. The citizen body excluded women entirely. It excluded the very large enslaved population entirely. It excluded resident foreigners, many of them long settled and prosperous, who paid taxes and served in the fleet and could never vote. When you add these together, the proportion of the adult population of Attica that actually held political rights may have been somewhere around 10 to 20%. And direct democracy has a temperament. An assembly can be swept. The most notorious episode involves a decision, taken in anger, to execute the entire adult male population of a rebellious city, and the ship sent to carry out the order, and then the assembly meeting again the next day, having slept on it, reversing itself, and a second ship rowing desperately through the night to arrive in time. It did arrive, barely, but the first vote had been perfectly legal and perfectly democratic, and of course this assembly, or a court drawn from it, voted to kill Socrates. The Greeks themselves argued fiercely about all this. Plato thought democracy was rule by flattery. Aristotle, characteristically, went and studied 158 constitutions before offering a measured verdict, and concluded that the many, deliberating together, may collectively judge better than any individual expert, while also warning what happens when a democracy stops respecting its own laws. But stay with the hill for one more moment, because there is something quietly astonishing about it that gets lost in the criticism. Somebody had the idea. Somebody, in a world of kings and priest-kings and god-emperors, where authority had always descended from above and was justified by birth or divinity, proposed that a community should govern itself by talking, that the herald should ask who wishes to speak, and mean it, that a potter's opinion counted the same as an aristocrat's when the hands went up, that power should be lent out by lottery and taken back within the year. They did it imperfectly, and they did it on the backs of people they had no intention of including, and they eventually lost it. Athens fell under Macedonian control within a couple of generations of Aristotle's death, and the assembly's real power ended. Direct democracy of this kind disappeared from the world for the better part of 2,000 years. But the idea did not disappear, because they wrote it down and argued about it in books that survived. And when men in Philadelphia and Paris went looking, centuries later, for a vocabulary in which to describe what they were attempting, they found the words waiting for them on a hillside in Attica. Speaking of which, the balance of power in this world is about to shift entirely, and it will happen because of a boy in the north who slept with a copy of Homer under his pillow. Let your breathing go slower now. The night is nearly through, and we have one last journey to make, right across the known world and back again. He was 13 when Aristotle came to teach him. The setting, according to the tradition, was a place called Miesa, a retreat with shaded walks, and a grove sacred to the nymphs, at some distance from the court. The king had summoned the most learned man in the Greek world to educate his son, and the payment, in one story, was the rebuilding of Aristotle's hometown, which the king himself had previously destroyed. What the boy took from it, above everything, was Homer. He is said to have kept a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, and to have slept with it beside a dagger under his pillow. He identified himself with Achilles, whose story is not about conquest at all, but about honor, rage, friendship, and the choice between a long, quiet life and a short, blazing one that is remembered forever. Understanding that is understanding Alexander. He was not a man executing a strategic plan for territorial expansion. He was a young man living inside an epic poem, measuring himself against a hero who had been dead, even then, for 8 centuries. His father was assassinated when Alexander was 20. Within a couple of years he had crossed into Asia, and over the next decade he took the entire Persian Empire, the greatest power on earth, from the coast of Turkey through Egypt and Mesopotamia to the mountains of Afghanistan and over the Hindu Kush into the Punjab. I am not going to walk you through the battles tonight. They were brilliant, and they were terrible, and there is no version of this story in which enormous numbers of people did not suffer horribly. Cities were destroyed, populations were sold. His conduct grew harsher and more paranoid as the years went on, and he killed a close friend in a drunken rage and never entirely recovered from it. He is one of those figures whose achievements are impossible to deny and whose cost is impossible to justify, and I would rather leave that tension standing than resolve it falsely at this hour. What I want to show you instead is the curiosity, because it is the thread that runs from that grove at Mieza all the way to the edge of the world. He took scientists with him, surveyors, botanists, zoologists, geographers, historians. Specimens and observations were sent back westwards, and there is a persistent tradition that some went to Aristotle himself. His officers measured the distances they marched, and those measurements fed into Greek geography for centuries. When they reached rivers nobody had described, they recorded them. When they found unfamiliar plants, cotton, spices, rice, they wrote them down. The expedition down the Indus and along the coast of Persia produced a written account by his admiral Nearchus that survives in summary, full of tides and mangroves and whales. At the eastern limit, his army refused to go further. They had been marching for 8 years. They had heard there were more rivers and more kingdoms and no end. And it was there, in the monsoon rain in the Punjab, that Alexander finally turned back, reportedly having shut himself in his tent for days first. He died at 32 in Babylon, of a fever, possibly typhoid, possibly malaria, possibly complications of an old wound, and years of drinking. Asked on his deathbed to whom he left his empire, he is said to have answered, "To the strongest." Within a generation, his generals had divided it among themselves. And here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting for our purposes, because what he really left was not an empire at all. It was a language and a set of habits, spread across an area from Greece to India. He founded cities everywhere he went, many of them named after himself, and the greatest of them was Alexandria in Egypt. Under the dynasty founded by his general Ptolemy, that city built 2 institutions that changed the world. The first was the museum, which meant a shrine of the Muses, and was in practice the first great research institute, with salaried scholars, lodging, meals, and no teaching obligations. The second was the library, which set out to collect every book in existence. Ships arriving in the harbor were searched for scrolls, which were copied, with the copy sometimes returned to the owner and the original kept. Agents were sent to buy manuscripts across the Mediterranean. The ambition was total, and for a while it very nearly worked. What happened in that city over the following centuries is one of the high points of human intelligence. Euclid gathered the whole of geometry into 13 books, beginning from a handful of definitions and 5 postulates, and deriving everything else in strict sequence. His Elements became the second most printed book in Western history, and was still being used as a school textbook in the 20th century, well over 2,000 years after it was written. Abraham Lincoln taught himself logic from it by candlelight. Eratosthenes, who ran the library, worked out the circumference of the earth without leaving Egypt. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice the sun shone straight down a well at Syene in the south, casting no shadow, while at Alexandria, a vertical rod cast a shadow of about a 50th of a full circle. Assuming the sun's rays arrive parallel and the earth is a sphere, the distance between the 2 cities must be a 50th of the way around the world. He had that distance paced out, multiplied by 50, and arrived at 250,000 stadia. We are not certain of the exact length of the unit he used. so we cannot say precisely how accurate he was. But on any reasonable reading of the Stad, he came remarkably close to the true figure, which is about 40,000 kilometers, with a stick, a well, and a walk. Archimedes, working in Syracuse but in constant correspondence with Alexandria, calculated pi to within remarkable limits, worked out the principle of buoyancy, described the mathematics of levers, and came close in one treatise to the methods of integral calculus. That treatise was lost, and then found in the 20th century, underneath a medieval prayer book, the original text scraped off and overwritten, still faintly readable. And there is one object I promised you earlier. In 1900, sponge divers sheltering from a storm off the island of Antikythera found a shipwreck, and among the statues and amphorae, they brought up a corroded lump of bronze. It sat unnoticed in a museum in Athens, until someone looked closely and saw gear teeth. It is a mechanism of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, dated to somewhere in the 2nd or 1st century before our era. It modeled the movements of the sun and moon, tracked calendars, showed the phases of the moon, predicted eclipses, and displayed the schedule of the games, including Olympia. Nothing of comparable mechanical complexity is known again for well over 1,000 years. Somebody built a machine to hold the sky. The night outside your window is very late now, or very early. Let your body be completely heavy. There is nothing left to do tonight except drift. We have one chapter left, and it is a quiet one. The Greek world did not end in a single moment. It was absorbed. Rome conquered Greece militarily, and was conquered by it culturally, as a Roman poet observed with some irritation. Educated Romans learned Greek, hired Greek tutors, copied Greek sculpture, and rebuilt their philosophy out of Greek materials. Then Rome itself fell in the West, and the libraries scattered, and a great deal was lost. Of the plays of one of the great tragedians, we have 7 out of perhaps 90. Whole schools of philosophy survive only as fragments quoted by people who disagreed with them. But the strange thing about ideas, as opposed to buildings, is how they travel when nobody is watching. Greek texts were preserved and studied in the Byzantine East. They were translated into Syriac and then into Arabic, and in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, scholars did not merely copy them, but argued with them, corrected them, and extended them, particularly in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Then those works came back into Latin Europe through Spain and Sicily, and set the medieval universities alight. And when scholars fled westwards after the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century, carrying manuscripts, the last great wave arrived, and Europe experienced what it later called a rebirth. Every one of those transmissions required someone to decide that an old book was worth the labor of copying by hand. Think about what that means. Somewhere, in a room, a person who did not know you and could not imagine your world spent months copying out a dialogue about justice, or a treatise on animals, or a geometry textbook, without any guarantee that it would matter. Everything we have talked about tonight reached us through a long relay of anonymous people making that choice, one manuscript at a time, across 2,500 years. And so what survived? The words survived, first, and they are hiding in plain sight. Music, mathematics, physics, biology, geography, history, politics, economics, ethics, logic, psychology, therapy, drama, comedy, tragedy, chorus, scene, character, energy, atom, planet, climate, crisis, chaos, harmony, idea, method, problem, analysis, theory, practice, school, academy, encyclopedia. You cannot describe modern intellectual life without speaking Greek for a substantial part of every sentence. Medicine survived in a particular way. The Hippocratic writings, a collection produced by a school rather than by one man, insisted that disease has natural causes and can be studied, observed patients closely, recorded case histories, and were remarkably honest about failures. The oath associated with the tradition, which included obligations to teach freely and not to harm, established the idea that a healer is bound by duties that go beyond the transaction. The details have changed. The principle has not. Mathematics survived as a method. The idea of proof, that you begin with stated assumptions and derive conclusions that cannot be denied by anyone who accepts the assumptions, is a Greek contribution to human civilization of almost unmeasurable value. It is the reason a piece of reasoning done in the 3rd century before our era is still true tonight and will be true in 1,000 years, and the questions survived. That is the part I want to leave you with, because here is what strikes me most, and it is not really a historical observation at all. They were asking your questions. When Socrates stood in the market and asked what courage actually is, he was asking the thing you have wondered about in your own life, when you could not tell whether staying was brave or leaving was, whether speaking up would be honest or merely self-indulgent, whether the difficult thing you are considering is strength or stubbornness. Nobody has ever given you a definition that settles it. He could not settle it either, but he thought the question was worth a lifetime. When Aristotle asked what makes a life go well, he was asking what you ask on the quiet evenings, when the day has been fine, but you are not sure it is adding up to anything. His answer is still one of the most practical ever offered, and it does not ask you to become someone else. It says that a good life is not a feeling you find, but a shape you build, out of what you repeatedly do, over years, mostly out of sight. When Plato described people watching shadows on a wall and mistaking them for the world, he was describing something you have already experienced at least once. That strange, disorienting period in a life when a belief you had never examined finally becomes visible as a belief, and you find you can put it down. When Heraclitus said you cannot step into the same river twice, he was saying the thing you feel when you look at an old photograph of yourself and cannot quite locate the person in it, and yet know, with complete certainty, that it is you. When the Athenians climbed that hill and asked who wishes to speak, they were wrestling with the same difficulty every community still wrestles with: how to include everyone without becoming a mob, how to hear expertise without being ruled by it, how to live together when we disagree. And when they carved "Know thyself" into a temple on a mountainside, they left the shortest instruction anyone has ever given, and the hardest. These were not superhuman people. They were ordinary human beings, in a small, poor, quarrelsome, sunlit country, dealing with grief and money and difficult relatives and bad weather, who happened to live at a moment when it became possible to ask certain questions out loud. They did not have answers. That is the point I would most like to leave with you. They had questions good enough to last 2,500 years, and every generation since has picked them up, turned them over, and passed them on unresolved. You are holding them now. Civilizations rise and fall. That country was overrun and absorbed and occupied, and its language changed, and its temples became churches and then ruins, and the marble was burned for lime by people who had no idea what it had been. Everything solid they built has crumbled or been quarried. The city that killed Socrates lasted a few generations more as a power, and then became a provincial town. And yet the questions they asked at the edge of the sea are being asked tonight, all over the world, in languages they never heard of, on a planet they knew was round but could not measure, by people whose existence they could not conceive. Ideas are the softest things human beings make, and they turn out to be the most durable. Not the walls, not the gold, the conversations. The sky outside is beginning to lighten now. Come back to the harbor with me, the one where we began. It is the hour before sunrise. The lamps went out long ago. The sea is the color of pewter, completely still, and there is no wind at all, and the whole coastline is holding its breath in that way it does, just before the light arrives. Everything we walk through tonight is out there in the dark, quietly existing. The old man in the courtyard at Miletus, looking up, wondering whether it might all be one thing. The row of listeners in Croton, who have not spoken for 3 years. The barefoot man in the marketplace, asking a general what courage is, and getting no answer either. The garden of olive trees outside the walls, the cave, and the long slope up towards the light. The doctor's son on the shore of Lesbos with his hands in the water, counting the parts of a creature nobody had bothered to look at properly before. The mountain, with its cloud on. The temple on the cliff, where the answers always came back folded. The stadium with its worn stone starting line. The courtyard house with its square of stars. The hill where a herald asked who wishes to speak. The boy with the poem under his pillow, who went all the way to the edge of the map and turned round in the rain. All of it gone, all of it still here. The horizon is beginning to warm now. Not color yet, just a slight difference. The sense that the darkness has become thinner in one direction. You do not need to hold on to any of tonight. That was never the point. Whatever settled in, and the rest can drift where it likes. There is no test in the morning, there never was. And if anything at all stays with you when you wake, let it be something small and easy to carry. That 2,500 years ago, people very much like you lay awake in the dark, wondering how to live, what was true, whether they were doing it right, and whether any of it mattered. That they never finished working it out. That they were kind enough and stubborn enough to write the questions down anyway and hand them forward. You are part of that. Simply by wondering, tonight, about anything at all, you are standing in a line that goes back to a man on a coastline looking at the water and having a thought nobody had ever had before. The light is coming up over the sea now, that first pale gold that touches the tops of things and leaves the rest in shadow. The temple on the hill catches it before anything else does. The colors in the stone begin to show again, red and blue and gold, all of it perfectly ordinary, all of it perfectly alive. Somewhere on the quay, a rope creaks. A fisherman, who does not know any of the names we have spoken tonight and does not need to, pushes out into water the color of pale metal, and the small sound of his oars carries a long way in the stillness. The world is starting again, the way it has every morning for as long as there have been mornings. Let yourself go now. Your body is heavy and warm and completely supported. Your breathing has already slowed without any help from you. In and out, like the tide down there on the stones. There is nothing to solve, nothing to decide, nothing that needs you before morning. If these documentaries mean something to your nights, it would mean a great deal to me if you subscribed, so we can keep making them together. Sleep into Power is on Spotify, whenever you'd rather listen with your eyes closed and your screen dark. And the Sleep into Power book is on Amazon, in paperback and on Kindle, if you'd like these ideas beside you in the daylight too. Thank you for spending this night with me. Thank you for the requests, the comments, the quiet company from every corner of the world, at every hour there is. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever tomorrow asks of you, you are welcome here tonight, and you always will be. Rest now. The lamps are out, the sea is calm, and the questions will still be here in the morning, exactly where we left them. Sleep into Power, guys. Good night.